Hey, what is up, guys? Thanks again for tuning in to hiswhitelight's Versus and the final episode of my Twisted Metal retrospective. We ended the last episode discussing how the shift in developer for the series began a downward spiral that saw the Twisted Metal series outdone by the games it helped inspire. Throughout the third and fourth entries in the series, however, there was a man who was keeping an eye on his creation, waiting for the right moment to take back the reins of this series, to make it darker and blacker than it had ever been before. Of course, that man is David Jaffe. Let's take a look at how he reinvigorated the series with the last two main console entries in the Twisted Metal series, Twisted Metal Black and the Twisted Metal reboot. It would be a full 2 years before Twisted Metal made another appearance in the video game scene, but for good reason. At this point, gamers were tired of release after release with no real innovation taking place. Sony also wanted to step back and plan for a new direction for the series to help it reclaim the throne it once had. In May of 1999, former single-track employees, including David Jaffe, formed a new studio called Incognito Entertainment. After coming to terms with Sony and the team at Incognito realizing their love for the Twisted Metal series, they were determined to set the series back on the right track. David Jaffe also wanted to really capture the vision he had for the first game, a vehicular combat game that was highly cinematic and engrossing with fully realized narratives for each of the characters. Jaffe also wanted to take the series back to its dark roots with mature themes and an almost horror-like atmosphere. In June of 2001, fans were able to finally get their hands on Twisted Metal Black, and the response was part sigh of relief and part shock and awe, as this entry did everything the fans were hoping for. Right off the bat, you could tell that this was not the Twisted Metal gamers remembered. From the title screen on, the game highlighted its new dark and outlandish tone. Everything was stylized and interesting, and the presentation was top quality, big budget fare. The characters, level design, graphics, and physics were all overhauled to capitalize on this new atmosphere. The narrative of this game was expanded in many ways that the other games either would not or could not accomplish at the time of their release. The story took place in the fictional city of Midtown, where most of the Twisted Metal contestants were being held at Blackfield Asylum. All of their respective character stories revolved around something that has at least indirectly put them inside the walls of this institution. Of course, like other games in the series, Calypso, who no longer sports long hair but is bald, promises that the winner of his contest will be granted a single wish. The contestants in this game were made up of 17 people from Blackfield Asylum, and many of your fan-favorite characters from previous games returned how David Jaffe originally intended them to be presented. Darkside is driven by Dollface, who was forced to wear a mask that she can never take off. Mr. Grimm, a military veteran of the Vietnam War, is trying to exact revenge on a man who made him a monster. More on that in just a bit. Axel, who builds his two-wheeled machine to win the contest and resurrect his wife, and of course, Sweet Tooth. A Sweet Tooth done right this time, in my opinion. He returns as a homicidal killer clown who was cursed at his own execution to live with his head on fire instead of dying. All around, just happy-go-lucky stories here, and among others, these guys were joined by a few newcomers that included Junkyard Dog, Brimstone, and Crazy 8. Jaffe and his team also made sure that each character had a story that took an extended look at their lives and what brought them to want to participate in the Twisted Metal contest. Each of them had experienced some horrific event in their life, and for the first time this was bookended by an opening, middle, and ending cinematic for each and every character. This led to some very memorable and dark stories presented within this game. Most of the stories within this game are great pieces of fiction in their own right, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to highlight two here because I can still remember seeing them for the first time because they were just that good. Mr. Grimm was in Vietnam when his comrade was shot and they were both captured by the Viet Cong. They were thrown in a deep hole to starve to death, and later he was visited by an American advisor who had defected and told him if he wanted to survive, he would just have to eat whatever he could find in the hole. Grimm held out for days, and then, after his friend finally died, he proceeded to eat him and fashion his skull into a helmet that he would never take off. After winning, Calypso delivers the American advisor to Mr. Grimm, who then proceeds to eat him also. Next, we have Sweet Tooth, who wanted Calypso to cure the curse put on him by Brimstone at his execution to have his head burned by a never-ending fire. Upon meeting Calypso, Needles immediately says that he has a stupid name and that he wanted to kill him right then and there. Well, this is certainly not your candy and ice cream Sweet Tooth. After winning the contest in true Sweet Tooth fashion, Calypso offers him the cure to his pain, but if Sweet Tooth ever killed again, his curse would return. Sweet Tooth then quickly states he needs to make sure his priorities are in order and murders Calypso right there. As the video ends, he says he will become the greatest of all time. Well, No more paper bags with this ending. On the gameplay side of things, the series has, in my opinion, never been better. Each level was packed with interactive elements and secrets, like shooting down a plane on the Junkyard level, only to see it crash into the level itself, to destroying the supports on the Ferris wheel in the suburbs level and watching it roll across town, destroying everything in its path. Each level seemed to have aspects to its design like these, and some even led to the unlocking of boss characters. The AI in the game was also an improvement over all the others, making this game a difficult one. NPC cars would chase players down, flank them, and really put the hurt on. The key to survival in this game was always to be moving, so as not to be attacked with a relentless barrage of missiles. The cars in this game all had a life of their own, and even their special attacks were representative of the drivers and the dark events that had taken place in their lives. For example, Brimstone was a priest and his car had stained glass windows. He also had a spike on the front of his car where a person strapped with explosives would be impaled. Using his special would send this person flying onto another car where he would detonate himself, causing massive damage. The most recognizable special, however, is Sweet Tooth's. He literally transforms his ice cream truck into a mech and unleashes a barrage of missiles upon whoever happens to be near him. This special would be carried over to other entries in the series as well, so even considerable time was spent making sure each special for each character was spectacular and relatable to their backstory. The bosses of this game were also fun to take on and consisted of Minion, Tanker, and Warhawk. We all know who Minion is, and Tanker is of course a tanker truck with a flamethrower. These served as a mid-boss, and players would fight him on the final stage of the game, Warhawk's rooftop. The explosion from the tanker truck would damage Warhawk and allow him to be vulnerable to attack, as Warhawk was the final boss in the game. Also, here's a little bit of trivia for you. Warhawk was originally planned to be in the very first Twisted Metal game, but was cut because of hardware limitations at the time. Warhawk is also another series that was developed by both Singletrack and Incognito Entertainment, with the game being released alongside the original Twisted Metal, and also being released early in the PlayStation 3's life cycle. This was by far the most praised entry in the Twisted Metal series as well. Outlets like IGN gave the game a 9.6 out of 10 and stated, "The game delivers the ultimate car combat experience and is leaps and bounds above any other games of its ilk." GameSpot had similar things to say about the game, scoring it a 9.5 out of 10 and saying, "In the end, Twisted Metal Black is a terrific game in every respect. The game looks, sounds, and most importantly plays better than any car combat game that came before it." It seemed that every other outlet heaved similar praise on Black. This entry would go on to sell a total of 1.41 million copies. This would also be the first Twisted Metal outing to have online capabilities on console, with an expansion disc released alongside the PS2 network adapter called Twisted Metal Black Online. Players could play any of the maps and characters online against their friends, extending the replayability of this game immensely. At this point in time, all was fine and well in the car combat genre. Twisted Metal's reputation had been redeemed, and players were all intrigued by what lied ahead for the series. I know I was playing this game every day, and it's certainly an amazing title. However, audiences were looking to see what else Jaffe and his team had to offer them. Unfortunately, little did they know they would have to wait 11 more years for another entry in the series to be released. Before we move on to the next and final entry in the series, let's quickly discuss the rumored and canceled sequel to Black that was titled Twisted Metal Harbor City. This game was supposed to have a limited open world and a system of highways that connected each battle arena in the game. There were also on-foot sequences for both Sweet Tooth and Brimstone, who would serve as central figures in the story. Footage and some unfinished levels for the game were included in the special edition of Twisted Metal Head On, a PSP game ported to the PS2. Of course this sounds interesting, but why was the game actually canceled? I could not get confirmation on this as the sources varied in credibility, but apparently several members of the development team were killed in a plane crash during the development of the title. Some believe this was just a marketing ploy to increase the mysterious nature of the title, but if that were the case, why did the game still get canceled? You would assume that a marketing tactic like this would be used to build up interest in a game that actually gets released. So in the end, we may never get a definitive answer to this question. Alright, so let's move into the sixth and final main release in the Twisted Metal line of games, 2012's reboot simply titled Twisted Metal, developed by David Jaffe's new team at Eat, Sleep, Play. This entry in the series was debuted at E3 2010 to much fanfare. I can remember watching Sony's press conference live stream that year and hoping that we would get to see another Twisted Metal, contrary to what David Jaffe said in multiple interviews, stating that a new game and himself would not be present at E3 at all. Just as the event was about to be over, attendees were treated to a conversation between two cab drivers discussing Twisted Metal and its absence on PS3. One of them then flicks a cigar onto the ground, which is picked up by none other than Sweet Tooth himself, and the crowd roared. Then David Jaffe and Scott Campbell came out on the stage to show what they had created so far for this new Twisted Metal game. 2 years later, it would finally release on PS3 on Valentine's Day of 2012. This game would take a different approach to storytelling than other titles in the series. In the campaign mode of the game, there were only 3 playable characters, namely Sweet Tooth, Mr. Grimm, and Dollface. However, you could choose to drive any of the available vehicles as each of these characters. And speaking of vehicles, this Twisted Metal included a lot to choose from. Of course, players had their fair share of returning characters like Sweet Tooth, Axel, and Outlaw, but a majority of the cast of cars was made up of newcomers. I know. I complained about this in the other games in the series, but in this title, the car lineup was actually pretty awesome and improved the game. Players had everything from Reaper, which was a motorcycle whose special included the ability to throw flaming chainsaws, to Juggernaut, who was a massive transfer truck and may have been a slight nod to the Death Race movies. Okay, back to the story of the game. One issue that I had with this entry in the series was its sole reliance on shock value over interesting narrative. While each of the 3 playable characters had a beginning, middle, and ending movie that took considerable time to give players a good chunk of narrative to digest, their stories were filled with an uncomfortable amount of violence, even more so than Black, and an almost steadfast reliance on every other word being a curse word. Unfortunately, this did not add to the narrative or impact of the stories, and only served to be off-putting to me. For example, Sweet Tooth's story revolved again around him reveling in being a serial killer, but is more focused this time around. He wants to kill the one person who has escaped him, and Calypso is the only one that can make that happen. There is a twist that I won't spoil, but it is certainly the most interesting story in the game. Mr. Grimm's story, however, pales in comparison to his from Twisted Metal Black, and I can remember being very underwhelmed by it. Grimm's father was an Evel Knievel type stuntman who died at one of his events. Mr. Grimm wants to go back in time and warn his father not to try the stunt. He blames his father's death for how his life has gone wrong and for all of his misdeeds. When he finally is sent back, he appears in the back seat of the car in which his younger self and his father are riding. His father attacks him, they wreck, and then the younger Grimm shoots and kills the older Grimm. But it's never explained what happened to his father. This is just bad storytelling. Plot holes are everywhere in these storylines. Lastly, we have Dollface's story, which is another disappointment in my opinion. Dollface was a model who was willing to kill the others around her to be the best. She eventually became very popular, but after a car wreck, became obsessed with a small scar on her face. Then she goes to see a blind midget for facial reconstruction. Yeah, I know, what was she thinking? And he puts a cursed mask on her that she cannot remove. She then wishes to be the best model on the biggest runway in the world, and, you guessed it, Calypso puts her on an airplane runway just as a plane is landing. Dollface is dead. Weak story in my opinion. Now that we've discussed the narrative of the game, let's talk about the gameplay in Twisted Metal. And it plays much like Black did in that movement is the key to survival and levels are packed with interactive elements. Now, after playing through the story campaign, it is easy to see that this game was built from the ground up with an emphasis on multiplayer. Players are given 4 factions to align with that included the Clowns, the Dolls, the Skulls, and the Holy Men that represented characters from the campaign. Players also had several modes to choose from that offered 16-player matches with multiplayer game staples like Deathmatch, Team Deathmatch, and Last Man Standing. The biggest standout here was a mode called Nuke that pitted rival factions against one another to launch a missile and destroy a heavily guarded statue of the opposing team. Players could also pilot helicopters in this mode, which really made for some interesting and hectic gameplay. The first objective was to take down the faction leader of the opposing side. Then players had to drag him or her behind their car to the missile launch site where they fed the machine the faction leader, thus launching the missile. Players then had to steer the missile into the enemy statue without it being blown up by enemy players. It was a surprisingly strategic mode that really encouraged teamwork from every player to be successful. The press also seemed to really like this entry in the Twisted Metal series and were elated that series creator David Jaffe brought it back into the limelight. Our mainstays IGN and GameSpot both heaped high praise on the game for its action-packed gameplay and focus on multiplayer, but did criticize the game game for its obvious narrative plot holes that I mentioned earlier. IGN gave it a 9 out of 10, and GameSpot scored it an 8 out of 10. Not all outlets complimented the game, however, especially overseas. The official PlayStation Magazine UK scored it a 7 out of 10, stating that it could be considered a successful return, but they were critical of its over-the-top violence and pushing the line of what is considered decent in the UK. And this was about the censored version that was released there. This last entry in the Twisted Metal series sold around 830,000 copies. Alright guys, so that wraps up my retrospective series on Twisted Metal. It's been interesting for me to reflect on how much time I had actually spent playing the Twisted Metal games throughout my lifetime, and the impact they had had on not just my life, but the video game world. Let me know in the comments below what you thought about the series, and if you enjoyed this retrospective, make sure you're subscribed to my channel for more gaming news and commentary. Thank you for the support, and for tuning into His White Light's Versus. Until next time, guys.